flu is on the move. The virus has arrived in yet another province.
They're concerned about any health problem that's on the mainland. It's not going to stay there.
Showing the vaccine only thought to be 10% effective.
Nationwide, there are already more than 41,000 cases confirmed. Every state in the country reporting widespread flu activity.
As of this morning, 18 countries around the world have reported cases of the flu within their borders.
Numbers out of Australia as of mid-October are concerning. If you get sick, stay home.
Total Recall by Arnold Schwarzenegger. So if you haven't figured it out yet by now, I go through quite a few books. So as a result, I tend to keep a close eye on Audible sales and wait for just a mass sell-off before I restock my library. Even though I only review one book a week, I probably listen to closer to 2-3 books a week, depending on obviously the length. And typically only the good books make it on my channel, because who wants to hear a book review about a crappy book? And if a book's that bad, I probably won't even finish it. This is kind of one of those books where I was a little bit reluctant to buy. I just figured it was a celebrity fluff piece of hitting all the grand stories and highlights of my career. Basically just a money grab by Arnold. So when you think of Arnold, you tend to think of more of his successes, like with his movies, Terminator, or whichever one it happens to be, or his Mr. Universe championships. And he could have made a career at any one of those things, but it's almost like he had a whole string of careers in his life, starting with the bodybuilding, which really kind of set the foundation of what would become basically his empire. But probably my favorite part of the book is the beginning, where it lays out his home life. So being that you think of him as this big, larger-than-life superstar, he actually grew up in a very small farm village in Austria. His house was so small and so humble, it didn't even have running water. They had to haul water up in buckets, basically like a peasant life. The whole family took baths like in the main room of the house, sharing wash water, and by the time it got to Arnold, which was the youngest child in the house, it was almost like a gray water. The book goes into more detail, like for example what his parents were like, as kind of a harsh father, not a bad father, but definitely a harsh father. Not letting his children get out of line, that's for sure. But the point is with Arnold, one thing about him, I think, which probably set his attitude and his outlook and probably really seeded in his drive from an early age, was that this guy really knows what it's like to be hungry. He knows what it's like to fight his way up from the bottom. And I think a lot of that has to do with his situation growing up, where he grew up, and the people that surrounded him as he was a child. It also kind of hints at him being a little bit of a loose cannon as a youngster. A lot of funny little situations that he gets himself into, especially driving a tank, accidentally driving a tank through a wall. Now, you wouldn't think that would be like a life-altering event, but as it turns out, I think that's where he learned how to be a mason. The masons on the base watched him as he fixed it, kind of instructed him the whole way. Just lots of little weird stories like that. And they gave this guy a tank to drive around at a young age. And obviously the story goes on from there, but the one thing that it does is it kind of gives the sense that he's kind of a loose cannon kid. And in a way, the book almost reminds me of Forrest Gump. Instead of having a mentally challenged guy, it's got a bodybuilder for the main character. From that point on, it's almost as if he kind of flows through history, ending up places. Part of the reason probably why that was is he wasn't afraid to ask people. If he wanted to get into bodybuilding, he found people that were great at it and got advice. Same thing with acting. He made some very powerful friends very early on, and for whatever reason, they just really liked his attitude, and he wasn't asking for handouts, he was asking for more guidance. It was very clear he obviously wasn't afraid to do the work. Lots of funny stories of him coming to the United States, barely speaking English, not quite understanding things, not quite understanding the culture. The first time his experiences making movies, which were hilarious, or a lot of lessons he didn't know, and again, he asked people who were far better at making movies than he was. For example, on the set of Conan, he sought out James Earl Jones. I mean, what better coach are you ever going to get than James Earl Jones? So somehow, even though he came across as kind of a fumbling bodybuilder, he managed to make outstanding contacts, and one contact led to another, and I think really he was a master at network. Perhaps one of his greatest contacts he ever made was Lucille Ball, and for whatever reason, thought the world of Arnold, going so far as to have him on the show. And if I remember correctly, I think that was his first appearance I think it was prior to Hercules in New York, I think. And for a guy who couldn't barely speak English, people loved him. Arnold's had a long career, probably the most popular for his roles in movies. But after finishing this book, I can't help but think of him more as a businessman than a movie star, more as a businessman than a bodybuilder. But probably the greatest point to walk away from this book with is that the one quality that probably made him the most successful was that Arnold wasn't afraid to fail. He had lots of blunders, fumbled over his lines in movies, probably not the greatest actor, but you could probably argue he's one of the most iconic. As a matter of fact, it also reminds me of Richard Branson's attitude. He was famous for saying that he hated when people would call him lucky. Oh, you're so lucky, Richard, you're so lucky. Richard Branson was lucky because he tried various business ventures and he wasn't afraid of failing. In fact, most of them did. And probably my favorite one from those books is when he took on Coca-Cola by driving a tank up Times Square and shooting a cannon at the Coca-Cola sign. Read those books if you want to read about a giant failure. But if you look at Richard Branson, do you think of him as a failure? No, he's an outstanding success, and so is Arnold, even though they both failed a lot. They weren't afraid to take chances. This book is basically a list of all the chances that Arnold Schwarzenegger has taken, but I think that's a theme with extremely successful people. I'm a huge fan of biographies for the reasons I stated previously. Probably my most favorite are anything written by Walter Isaacson, but probably the most favorite is the Steve Jobs bio. I would say that Arnold Schwarzenegger's is now a close second, so I couldn't have been more surprised after listening to this book. The only reason I would say it's a second is there's a huge chunk when he was obviously the governor. I'm not a huge fan of politics, but it's part of his life, so it's in there and it's pretty detailed. So I'm going to say the Steve Jobs biography is still probably my number one favorite. Arnold Schwarzenegger's is probably a close second. And to make things better, now that Arnold is wound down and getting older, and he actually was able to buy the same tank that he drove in the Austrian army, and now he has it in LA, and I guess he crushes cars and various other things for charity.
I'm going to crush a copy of $1 Million Baby because it makes me cry. I don't cry.
I'll post the links for all of that below, as well as the books mentioned. If you're into biographies, I strongly recommend you check out Arnold Schwarzenegger's Total Recall. And if you've read it in the past, let me know what you thought of it in the comments below, and I'll talk to you next time.